The Kavirondo district was held at Kissy by District Commissioner Spencer, with a police detachment of 10 to 30 police askari. Meanwhile, at Kisumu, there was a garrison of 90 men in G Company 4th King's African Rifles, 100 police askari, and a 130 volunteer town guard. Kisumu is vital, as it's the port on Lake Victoria that is on one end of the Ugandan Railroad, linking it to Nairobi and Mombasa. A German force from Bokuba, under Captain Wilhelmina Bock von Wolfingen, named Abdelingt Bock, was a massive column for those early days. Captain Wolfingen was part of the Schutztrupp's Berlin staff and had been visiting the colony when hostilities broke out. He was able to mass a force quickly with 400 men under arms, with a large non-combatant carrier support, and was also comprised of 52 German volunteers, not part of the Schutzen Company, 266 askaris in the 7th Field Company, 100 Rugga Rugga native warriors in support. Additional heavy support for the column came in 3 machine guns and a field artillery piece. It's doubtful Vorbeck was truly aware of this force's size and its coming actions, as his focus was on the East African coast, Kilimanjaro area of operations, and raising new troops in August and September 1914. He simply calls it a small body. This massive column crossed into British East Africa on the east shore of Lake Victoria, under escort from the German steamer Mzee on the 5th of September. His first objective was the British Boma administrative building at Kissy. On the 9th of September, the column captured the village port of Karungu. When Karungu fell, British District Commissioner Spencer withdrew his police from Kissy to Wire Hill. With news the Germans had crossed the border, Nairobi called on the neighboring British-Ugandan protectorate for aid. Uganda was already stretched thin, having sent an expedition to quell the Turkanan revolt. The protectorate scrambled and sent a total of 4 separate companies to the area, immediately dispatching C and D Company of the 4th King's African Rifles to Wire Hill to rally with G Company of the 4th King's African Rifles on the 11th of September, while the reserve company of the 4th King's African Rifles and a 90-man Ugandan police company were sent to Kindu. C, D, G companies of the 4th King's African Rifles were under the command of Captain Thornycroft, and guided by Commissioner Spencer and his police askari, moved to retake Kissy. Arriving at 10:30 a.m. on the 12th of September, Captain Thornycroft deployed his men in the hills overlooking Kissy. The British were able to witness the German occupiers holding a celebratory parade in the village. The German parade was quickly fired upon by the elevated British askaris from extreme distance. The German artillery piece tried to fire on the British in the hills, but by the time it had fired a pair of ranging shots, the entire German field gun crew was cut down by C Company's Lieutenant Mussen's machine gun. The Germans attempted to man their other heavy support weapons, but kept at bay by the British machine gun fire. Thornycroft at noon that day took half his company of askaris and attempted to roll the German flank. Pushing the encroaching Germans skirmishing towards the British, Thornycroft attempted to push back the Germans in the thick brush. He had somewhat managed to do so. The Germans backed across the stream that separated the hills from the village when he himself was shot when the rifle barrels from both sides were touching and firing point-blank at one another. This sudden point-blank fire caused the British to fall back across the river. For the majority of the day, both sides simply fired back at one another. In the afternoon, G Company and Spencer's police were pushed back as the European Germans crossed the stream in a rush charge. With the flank collapsing, Mussen has the British forces withdraw back to Wire Hill. That night, coincidentally, the reserve company, 4th King's African Rifles, arrived at Wire Hill. Back at Kissy, Wolfingen struggles to compare his success of driving off the British with his tactical losses. There are 89 German dead, and himself wounded. Half of his European volunteers were dead, charging through the open brush. His heavy support pieces are now oversized paperweights. The crew's gone or heavily diminished. The Germans' black powder firearms giving away their positions were cited as the cause for the heavy losses. The native auxiliaries, Rugga Ruggas, and carriers are panicked. Another action could see them flee into the bush. Wolfingen opts to fall back, executing the withdrawal in the early morning. The dead and wounded are left for the British to find in the village. When the British enter Kissy at noon on the 13th of September, the British record over 100 German personnel. British casualties totaled 7 dead and 14 wounded. For a time, some of the local tribes saw these actions as an omen to a prophecy about the British being overthrown, led to a rise in native insurgent attacks at Homa and Karungu being carried out. These stocks of goods were restored and shipped, and this movement seems to have been tired by October 1914. Meanwhile, the British weren't focused on putting this native unrest down. They were instead focused on chasing down Omdailung Bok. William Boker was a South African Boer War veteran living in East Africa at the outbreak of World War I. He had a reputation for being a rough fellow. Boker's horse was a collection of South Africans living in British East Africa that were excellent riders and well versed in Swahili. They were also known to be avoidant of drill and training, which would have repercussions later. When the unit was given uniforms and rifles, this squadron retained their own arms, if they wished, and allowed to maintain the initials BH on a flash on their various headwear. The squadron was the largest of the troops raised and formed B Squadron of the East African Mounted Rifles. Meanwhile, E Squadron was commanded by A.E. Bingley, a Boer War veteran with his son as his orderly, and raised the squadron in close coordination with B Squadron. Both Boker's and Bingley's estates were situated close together north of Nairobi. This relationship continued over time as both squadrons operated together in almost all combat situations in the early months of the conflict. Horses were commandeered from local farms, but typically lacked the numbers needed, so polo ponies or mules were a common sight with the East African Mounted Rifles. These unusual mounts on both the German and British sides were the cause of much profanity while training. Despite cavalry training, B and E Squadron's horsemen's first campaign wouldn't be over land, but rather a naval amphibious landing without their mounts. From the 30th of August to the 10th of September, the two squadrons patrolled the Magadi Railroad. The Magadi front was opposite Longidu, a German camp of operations. While the East African Mounted Rifles didn't spot the enemy, their account shares they had lots to learn about campaigning in the African bush. Many hadn't even packed utensils or tea, and they soon grew sick of eating freshly hunted game for every meal. Luckily, the four other squadrons would take up the defense of the area, while B and E squadrons were to be sent to Karungu on Lake Victoria without horses. On the 13th of September, the men stabled their steeds, shared drinks at Nazareth's bar, and at 22:30, under storm clouds, mounted train cars for Kisumu. After arriving at Kisumu, they boarded the HMS Winifred. The HMS Winifred was to sail and deploy the B and E squadrons to Karungu to capture the retreating Germans from Kissy. After suffering terribly by the 4th King's African Rifles on the 13th of September, these German forces were retreating to Karungu. Packed with around 95 cavalrymen, a section of police askari, and the vessel's crew packed tight on the deck, they made the trip without incident. The Winifred was just about to lower its landing craft when a pair of rifle shots came from shore. The East African Police Askari section on board responded to the rifle smoke from shore with a mad minute, and silence returned. Followed by a massive explosion from a cannon on the shore, the first rounds went long and the cavalrymen hit the deck. The Winifred began to fire on the shore. Just as a German steamer, Mzee, launched from a nearby dock, its pom-pom gun firing. After a Boer War veteran grabbed the deck-mounted Hotchkiss gun to rake the shore, the shoreline Germans withdrew into the reeds to let the two vessels duel. After the smokestack was hit and its splinters rained down over the deck, the Winifred withdrew. The East African Mounted Rifles suffered no casualties, other than, to quote, suffered mainly from fright. The Winifred was able to withdraw and at some point rallied with the HMS Kavirondo. The pair returned to Karungu. This time, when the pair of British steamers returned, the shore and village were abandoned by the Germans and the Mzee had departed. Captain Bok, after his heavy casualties during Kissy, sought to avoid conflict, and now that the British were attempting to land on his flank, he thought it best to complete his retreat to Mwanza. To his credit, he completed this withdrawal without any more casualties and inflicted minor damage to a British steamer. The East African Mounted Rifles, having found the fishing village of Karungu without any enemy forces, deemed their mission complete. Both B and E squadrons were relieved by the 4th King's African Rifles and returned to the Magadi area on the 28th of September, 1914.